Redesigning a course for a new format can feel overwhelming. Hear how one faculty and instructional designer partnership turned that challenge into an opportunity to rethink goals, engagement, and student success. Welcome to Speaking of Higher Ed. I'm Andrew Everett. This is episode 33. Today, my colleague Jeff Mastromonaco talks with Mary Peabody and Dr. Peter Demerjian from Georgia State University. They are discussing how collaborating with an instructional designer can help build on your existing course to make it even more engaging and effective for students. Here's their conversation.
My guests today are Mary Peabody, who is a learning experience designer at Georgia State University, and Dr. Peter Demerjian, an associate professor and the director of the School of Accountancy at Georgia State's Robinson College of Business. So Mary works with faculty to redesign courses across various subjects, including public health, AI, and Online MBA. She's presented at conferences on topics like design thinking, course design, and multimedia integration. Dr. Demerjian, as the director of the School of Accountancy, has led several initiatives such as the reorganization of the Master of Professional Accountancy program, and he's also contributed to the development of the new Master of Science in Artificial Intelligence and Business Transformation. So together, they have developed an asynchronous online business course, and they're here to discuss their process. So I want to thank you both for being our guests on Speaking of Higher Ed.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks.
So we'd like to get started by asking our guests to maybe tell us about their career path or what led us to their current position. Maybe Dr. Demerjian, you can go first.
I'd be happy to. And thanks again for having us here today. I love talking about this. So in terms of my becoming an accounting professor and then the director of the School of Accountancy at Georgia State, I was roughly 25 years ago an MBA student. And it was in my MBA program that I discovered this great love of accounting. I hadn't been an accountant before that, but I had an amazing instructor in this class that was just super inspiring. And I knew within probably a week of being in that class, this is what I want to do. So I thought I was going to be a business person. I was getting my MBA, but I realized that higher ed was the direction I was going in. So from my MBA program, I went directly to my PhD program at the University of Michigan. 5 years there, which is the norm. And I came out and I've had a series of positions. My first job was at Emory, then at the University of Washington, and most recently before Georgia State, University of Illinois, Chicago. And I've been at Georgia State since July of 2022, so just about 3 years, a little more than 3 years now. And when I came back to Atlanta and took this position, I was hired as an associate professor and also as the director of the School of Accountancy. So they were looking for someone to take the reins of the department, and they decided I was the person who would be capable of doing that. And I've been doing it ever since.
Great. Mary, what about you? What has led you to your current position?
That's a great question. I guess I have two answers. One's maybe more interesting than the other one. I think if I want to talk about how I think I got like instructional design in my blood, I think I had two really awesome jobs right out of college that led me to be an instructional designer. One being an ESL teacher and one being a marching band instructor, because both things are like just highly instructional design all the time. They're both things where you have a big, what you want the students to do is a big picture thing, and that's what you're trying to work on. And from there, you have to break it down into like smaller segments of what they can do. From those segments, you have to bring it down into skills. From the skills, you have to break it down into like different exercises or practice. Whether it's a marching band show, breaking it down to parts, to skills and stuff, or whether it's ESL. Obviously, the goal is speak English and be able to communicate in life and where you're living, and being able to break that down into what situations do you need to communicate in? What topics do you have to communicate about? Okay, so what grammar do you need? And what vocabulary? So what do you need to pronounce? So I feel like that's the real answer of like, how did I discover like instructional design is my thing? The more straightforward answer is I was a high school teacher for a couple of years, got into ESL for a while, moved into curriculum design, was the director of a ESL school for a little bit, discovered I didn't want to be in administration necessarily, and was really fortunate to move into instructional design, find that as like, oh, that's a cool job I can do at GSU. So I've been here for about 4 years now.
Okay, great. Well, I appreciate both of you being here today, and I think the overall theme for today, in looking how the two of you have collaborated on creating this online course is, to talk about things like flexibility and open-mindedness and this, collaboration between, faculty and instructional designer. When you're talking about adapting a course that I think was originally face-to-face and you've created it this online format. So what prompted you with the decision to develop this asynchronous online version of, is it an accounting course? Is that correct?
It is. This is the core accounting course for our Master of Business Administration, which is kind of our flagship business program. And the real prompting for this, quite candidly, is we were told to do this from up above. But the story is actually, I think it's a little more nuanced than that, in the sense that Georgia State's always been an institution that's really focused on providing access and opportunity to students. And that started taking on much more of a complexion of how can we experiment with different modalities that's going to make education available to students who, for example, can't necessarily get downtown to take classes 2 or 4 days a week. So we knew online education is something we're going to be pushing increasingly towards because it is going to improve the ability of some students to make it there. And we really didn't want to leave that kind of talent on the table. The specifics of this were at Robinson, we were reorganizing our MBA program. So we were shrinking it down a little bit from 54 credits to 42 credits, reimagining the structure. So we kind of rebuilt it as a core of 10 classes and then kind of an elective concentration of 4 classes. And in so doing, this seemed like a really good time to make the move towards an online asynchronous delivery because we hadn't had that modality. We had had in-person primarily. We had had the obligatory COVID shuffle that got us into online synchronous, but we hadn't really developed online asynchronous, and we felt like this was a valuable modality for people who are busy, for people who are geographically quite far from Georgia State, right? Because then we're not worried about time zones. People can work at their own pace. So that was really kind of the prompting there with this bigger change that was taking place in the MBA program.
You guys have got your marching orders. You've been voluntold to create this course. How did you actually start that? What was the development process?
Mm-hmm. So I'll really briefly, I think I had originally actually been assigned somebody different, Mary, before you stepped in. So I knew there was a different name, but then it was getting time to be the first meeting, and I got a notice saying, well, you're actually going to be working with Mary Peabody. I'm like, okay, that sounds fine. And by the time, and I'll let you talk about this, Mary. Mary had a whole plan in place before we even met. And for me, it was the introduction to the Miro board. So I'm going to hand off to Mary there, and she can talk about how she kind of laid the groundwork for our collaboration.
I've worked with Mary before, too, and that tracks. Yeah, for sure.
Thanks. You guys are too kind. Yeah, so I do like to have a plan in place before, and I think that we had this Miro board that Peter's talking about, and I've gone through various kind of variations on it, I guess, of what are the really good questions to ask right at the beginning of a relationship with a partner, with a faculty member, in order to draw out, look, what is this class really? I just don't want to look at your old syllabus and be like, okay, here's good syllabus, here's bad, what can we change? I want to know more about the class. I think, especially when you're changing modality from an in-person or a hybrid to a fully online, you can't just switch something over. It really needs to be reimagining. So the Miro board that we have is really, it goes in stages of starting the process of design thinking, more or less, where the beginning stages are going to be with empathizing and defining the problems. So we talked a lot about, okay, the students, what's going on in their life, what's going on in their MBA program, what's going on maybe their career, and what do we know about them? What do we want them to be able to do? What background might they have? What's their experience with finance, possibly, and how might they feel about that? Also, we talked at the beginning a lot about the program's limitations or constraints or requirements in terms of how many students are going to be in the course? How much will you actually be able to grade? Are you going to have a TA? What type of technology? Anything that came the requirements and limitations of the class. So that big brainstorming time. And then also trying to define what you want to get. What is their big goals? So kind of doing then another big instructional design thing or just education, backwards design of what do we want students to be able to do at the end of this? What is the goal? What's that big picture? And that became the goals. Then we started talking about how are we going to know that they're doing it? And that became the assignments. And we kind of moved on to like, well, how are we going to get them that information? And that became the content. So that's kind of the big mirror board. We brainstorm, start ideating.
Yeah. What was interesting to me in this process was I was certain we were going to meet, and we opted for a weekly meeting. And I was certain we were going to get to the first meeting, and it was going to be like, okay, what's in week 1? What's in week 2? What's in week 3? And I don't think we got to that until maybe a month into the process. It was very much this kind of mapping. And I remember very specifically the what do you want students to know? And now we're going to work our way backwards to what that actually looks like and how we get them there. It all totally made sense, and I never would have thought of it on my own. I never would have gone down that road on my own. I would have been much more kind of linear, and it's like, this is what a class looks like, and now I'm going to build it. So this was, that early period was, I think, particularly enlightening to me because it really helped me think about, well, what is this class supposed to be doing? And I hadn't really designed a class in that way before, and I think it was really useful, especially as we were going to this new modality that I had not experienced myself.
And I think one thing, Peter, that you mentioned up front too, and I think is worth mentioning is like you were thinking about the students, you're like, oh man, I want people who don't like numbers to maybe start to like numbers. I want everyone to love accounting. And I remember that stuck with me. And I think there's even like a sticky note on our board, our mirror board saying like, we want people to love numbers after this.
Yeah, and because this is always the problem with accounting is that it has a reputation of being hard and unpleasant or anything like that. It's a beautiful subject, but people need to be approach with it the right way. And I really wanted to approach this the right way because MBA is typically a place that's not super accounting friendly. This is kind of part of a core of what they need to know, but it's something that most students aren't terribly enthusiastic about.
Yeah, so it sounds like this, backwards design is basically the same, when it comes to, despite modality, whether it is face-to-face or online, that's kind of how you started the design. But you kind of led into what my next question was going to be. So now that you are designing in this asynchronous environment, how are you designing for that student engagement and interaction? And, maybe can you give some examples of how you were doing that?
Want me to go on this one?
Yeah, you go on this one.
Yeah, so this was I would say this was my biggest concern. At the time I was doing this, I had been a professor for 16 years, and I had taught. I would argue very effectively, and the vast majority of that was in person, and the entirety of it was synchronous, whether it was in person or online. And there's certain things you can do, particularly in the in-person setting, to encourage engagement because you're standing right there in front of them. You can really communicate. I mean, so much of my teaching was being out in front of the class, looking at the students, and when you look at them, you can tell they're getting it, they're not getting it, and you can really shift gears around that. And that kind of engagement, the students were able to connect with me as a person, as an instructor, and that kind of motivated them and kept them on track. So I'm thinking to myself, I'm going to be recording lectures, setting up exercises. How are they going to feel connected to any of this? And to me, this was really important. We had a series of meetings with all the instructors and all the designers, maybe monthly meetings or something like that. And we kind of talk about what we were doing and how we're thinking about it. And other instructors had the same concern. I think this is a very natural concern. And they were approaching it, a lot of them were approaching it almost as a translation exercise. This is what I do in person. How can I most closely translate this into the asynchronous setting? So a lot of them were employing, for example, like message boards, right? So you would have a prompt, you write a message, you write a communication to another student or the instructor, which is fine. I think in a lot of contexts, that's great. It wasn't going to be the right context in this. These were not, I mean, it's introductory accounting. It's not deep. It's not going to be here, express your views on this. So fundamentally, it had to be, well, there has to be something different that's going to keep the students engaged with what's going on. In my curriculum development, because I've developed curricula for several different accounting classes, I always like to have a little bit of a story with it because I think that business is stories, right? All that we're doing when we're doing accounting is we're just developing narrative around a business situation so people can make decisions. So I was opting to, rather than use a textbook, I was kind of writing my own material for this. And I wrote the material as kind of a 2 tracks in terms of story. Within the actual notes that I was putting together, so essentially I wrote a textbook, right? Within those textbook notes, I had a company called Spandau Pencil. And this was just something I made up. This was a company that imported really nice pencils from Germany and sold those. And I'm like, I just need a simple business. Import pencils, sell pencils, very straightforward. And I was actually able to dig through and find real pencils. So somebody looked up the pencils that they said, these are real pencils. And so I was able to use the pricing and so forth. So there's kind of a story there. And then I wanted to have in parallel to that a set of exercises that would kind of flow throughout the course that would introduce the different concepts at different times. And for that, I kind of thought, well, what are students going to be able to connect with? What are they going to be interested in? And I came up with a company called DeKalb Kicks, which is a sneaker reseller, because I know sneaker culture is really big. And this started as 3 MBA students who got together and decided they want to start this business. So I wrote this whole little story about the friends starting the business. They don't have enough money, so they get an investor. The investor turns out to be kind of a crummy guy, so they have conflict along the way and just kind of pulls them along. Mary saw this. So I had shared what I'd written for this curriculum. Mary saw this and she's like, hey, I should talk to multimedia. I'm going to hand off to Mary from here to tell what happened once we got our multimedia group involved.
Yeah. So, Peter came in with all this great content. And we're like, yes, threaded narrative is a thing we love to try to introduce into, especially online classes, to get that engagement. And this was such a ripe opportunity for it because he'd already done a lot of the work and had a great structure of the parallel companies to help teach and students to practice. So I reached out to our multimedia team. Shout out to all of CETLA GSU multimedia team. They're great. Liv, Garrett, everyone who worked on that. I think Anna, everyone who did editing and recording and all sorts of stuff. And they helped do some script work with Peter's already very good story to help write out just some conversations between these 3 MBA students who were starting a company, turning into a really great script. And we ended up recording it as a series, mostly of WebEx calls, where it'd be kind of like this, where it's like pretend they're on a Zoom or a WebEx call and they're talking and they're like, hey, talk about the business and this is a problem we're having. Oh no, what's going to happen? We got to hire someone. There's this villain guy that kind of comes in-ish. And so worked with multimedia to create the scripts, and then they had a few actors that they did. They used Riverside, so kind of like a program like this, and they recorded it and did a whole bunch of editing. So as the students were following along, each week there were about 2 or 3 mini episodes almost. They kind of ended up as a soap opera, kind of a feel with cliffhangers and stuff. But they'd watch and see, okay, these 3 students are having this problem. They have to deal with how this investor, I guess would be the word for investor's going to interact with them and the demands it's going to put on them, and come up with documents the investor demands, all sorts of different things that I don't remember the name of, but the different, what are they called?
Financial statements.
Financial statements. There we go.
Statements. Yeah.
Right, it's been so all the different financial statements. So the students' assignments end up being creating these financial statements. It's almost like they're kind of sewn in the company a little bit. They're there and creating these things to go along with it.
Of all the feedback I received about the course, the multimedia case dimension was the thing that students were absolutely the most positive about. They're like, it was interesting. It kept me involved with what was going on. It succeeded beyond my greatest expectations, but that was, I think, largely on the strength of this multimedia delivery. So this really, my story was fun, but they were going to be reading the story and doing exercises. Once we have the video recordings, we have the text threads and the emails. The actor they found to play the bad investor is just diabolical. It's just amazing. And it made all the difference because it really connected the students to what was going on.
Yeah. So in addition, kind of Peter alluded to it, but in addition to these videos that, our media team made, but might be difficult for one person on their own to make, there were also a bunch of interactions via emails and text messages. And so that was another way to add to the conversation, add to the narrative what was happening in a way that we could go back and change later, or people can create on their own a lot more easily. So that's another way besides video to kind of push the narrative, is different types of communications.
So in putting this together, what tools did you find the most valuable in developing this asynchronous course?
I guess for me, it's a lot of project management and idea management type of thing. So using the Miro board, and if you saw it, it looks this big on a screen, but in real life, the whiteboard would probably be the entire 2 or 3 walls behind me. And it had everything from our original ideas to about the brainstorming, all the way to like a rough structure of what the modules would look like, what each topic each week would be, what things would happen every week. They're going to have notes, they're going to have a video, they're going to have how many assignments, what topics. And then finally moved on to like when we had more of like prototype type stuff where it's, hey, look at this example of a script or look at these examples of visuals. Does this work? So using that kind of as project management was the big thing on my side of it. I don't know for you, Peter, if there's any.
Yeah, no, I think that kind of structure was critical. Every time I've done an online class or anytime I've done any class that has an electronic learning management system, there's always where is this? I couldn't find this, and you have a couple weeks of that. In this course, I had exactly 0 cases of anyone struggling to navigate the course at all. Everything was where it should be. Mm-hmm. Everything was exactly where you expected to be, laid out with clarity, laid out with logic, and it was intentional. It wasn't just, well, we'll just kind of put this out here and see what happens. There was intention based on Mary's kind of design. So we had essentially a template for doing this. And once we agreed, and there was some variation in that, how fine do we want the partitioning to be and so forth. But once we had that template, everything kind of flowed up into that, so that once you got through, and we had 5 modules for the course, once you had worked through module 1, everything you saw after that was going to be precisely the same template. It's the kind of thing that as an instructor, I'm much more focused on the material. And this is the kind of thing that I think can make a huge difference for student experience, so that there's not this kind of friction in them learning stuff. So I think that was indispensable for the students having a smooth experience, so they could be focusing on learning accounting as opposed to trying to figure out this environment and how to work their way around.
How to maneuver and how to navigate just in this new environment. It sounds like that this level of organization. Again, something that I've experienced having worked with Mary before, but that it really kind of made it easier to put together, and I guess was reflected in the end product. So, Dr. Demerjian, what would you say then? What was probably the most surprising or unexpected aspect of creating this as an asynchronous online course, maybe that you hadn't thought of before?
That's a great question, because I think probably like a lot of people who are making the move from being traditionally a synchronous instructor to be an asynchronous instructor, my first instinct was to grab the syllabus from the synchronous course and say, how is this going to work asynchronous? What do we have to change? And that was once I remember going to our faculty designer meeting. And it was probably second one, so it was probably like a month and a half in. And I said, you know what, everybody, I have freed myself from the constraints of the synchronous class, because I'd finally gotten away from that thinking that it has to be exactly parallel to the synchronous experience. I had to step back and say, there's things you can do in an in-person or a synchronous class that are not going to work with asynchronous. And that had initially been like, that's a limitation. And once I realized it wasn't a limitation, because there's so many things that you can do in an asynchronous setting that you can't do in a synchronous setting. Once I had freed myself from that impression that these things should be running kind of in parallel, I was able to get down to the very bottom of, well, what do I want to do? How do I want to deliver it? And from there, I wouldn't say it was easy, but once I was able to change my thinking around it, I got very comfortable with it. And particularly the work in the last several modules just really seemed to flow, because I knew exactly what I wanted to look like, how it should be going. And that was, it ended up being incredibly satisfying, because as we were going through, I initially thought, I think this is going to be okay. And as we got through, I said, I think this is going to be really good. I think students are going to like this, and I think they're going to learn from this.
So you kind of alluded a little bit to changing your way of thinking. How has this experience maybe impacted your teaching philosophy, if any, even for maybe even an in-person class? Has going through this maybe changed your way of thinking, or how, moving forward you would design a course even if it was face-to-face?
Yeah, it hasn't. I wouldn't say. I think it's helped me kind of progress down this road that I've been going down as an instructor for many years. As I started as a teacher, this was before online was very prominent at all. So everything was in person. And I stood in front of the class and I lectured them, right? And that's what we did. This was 18 years ago. And lecturing was still very much acceptable. This is exactly what had been handed to me. They're like, here's an intro class, just do it. Especially as I got closer to COVID, and especially in COVID, I started to move towards the more flipped approach. So it's like, you do a bunch of work ahead of time. We work on the application of that in class time. You come with questions and so forth. This, of course, relies on students being well prepared and doing the work. And so encourage them to do that work. And that's when I realized that unlike, say, high school, where a lot of the work and a lot of the learning takes place in class, so much of college work, undergraduate, graduate, whatever it is, takes place out of class. Really what you're doing in class time is keeping them on track and encouraging them to go home and put in the hours of work they need to do to be successful in the class. So what this has done for me is I've started to think of myself as less a teacher or instructor and more as a guide. And I am guiding you in the direction of doing the work you need to do so that you can learn the material. And I'll be here to point you in the right direction, answer any questions you have to provide clarity, but you have to do the work. That's really what it comes down to. This class, this design process, and this class taught me that this kind of guidance can happen in all sorts of different ways. Different students connect with material in different ways. And if we can hit students a couple different ways within the same course, you're going to lose fewer students along the way. And believe me, accounting is a subject we lose students all the time, right? So we're always trying to figure out ways, how do we keep them on track? Because a lot of times this is a requirement that they need to get them where they're going. So this kind of idea of guiding students and helping kind of point them in the direction and really support them was just really supplemented through this process.
So I'll throw this question out to both of you. What advice would you give to other faculty members who are considering developing their first asynchronous online course? Mary, maybe we'll start with you.
Yeah, I'd say, and I don't just want to repeat what we talked about earlier, but that backwards design process of like, what is it that you really want to get at the end of it, and use that to define, these are kind of my goals. Going backwards to like, how am I going to know they're doing it? Here's going to be some of our assignments, assessments, whether it's formative or summative. And then coming backwards to like, how am I going to get them the information so they can do that? And thinking, okay, now here I have my content. Instead of starting at, here's my content, here's my lecture, here's my textbook, here's my PDFs of something, and then going forward to go backwards with that would be one big one. And I think the other way is trying to think from a student's perspective of like, I'm logging into whether, this is online class. I need the navigation to be really clear. I don't have the professor right in front of me to ask questions. I need to know what to expect. I thought Peter did a great job of creating a navigation video at the first that students watched at the beginning. And he like walks students through kind of like the flow of a week and what to expect. So I'd super recommend that in terms of instructor presence and just to help students find their flow and understand the expectations and understand how to be successful, and putting that somewhere really clear for students to see. I think those would be two of my biggest pieces of advice. And also just to consider yourself, I'm sure we might talk about this in a second, but about as a faculty member, don't get in too deep and create too much work for yourself, something that, yeah, and you'll be able to talk about that way more than I will, Peter. But like, be considerate of yourself, and because the better you are for yourself, the more you'll be able to give to your students on like real useful feedback versus like busy work type of stuff or like technical logistical stuff. That is some of my advice.
Yeah, so I mean, there's many things I can say here, so I'll restrict it to just a few. One goes back to a point I tried to make before, which is be really open-minded about what you want the course to look like. It can and should look different from what you do in a synchronous class. And once you can get there, you'll be much more open-minded and develop something that's going to be really effective. So like Mary said, the students can learn. I think Mary's point about being kind to yourself as an instructor, I will put a little more texture on that, which is if something can be automated in the process, this makes a bunch of sense. It's going to basically, if you can save yourself from grading something that can be done as an automatically graded assignment, this unlocks you to do more value-added things as an instructor, answer questions, develop new exercises, and so forth. And the third thing I would say, and this one is, I think, the biggest piece, work with a course designer who's going to help you do this. I would not, even though I've been through the experience before, I would still want to have someone like Mary, or Mary preferably, but someone like Mary with her experience who's able to help me kind of frame up and put this together. If you're doing this for the first time, and I had this conversation with a few people who were moving into the same position I was just after I was, we as faculty, we have discipline-specific expertise. That's why we're teaching the class. But oftentimes our knowledge of course design and curriculum development is usually a little more ad hoc. We've picked it up along the way, in many cases very effectively, but for something that has such a specific sort of deviation from the way we've traditionally done things, having someone with expertise for that makes a huge difference, because it's going to both save you time, because you could learn this, but it would be a great deal of effort to do that. It's going to save you time, and they're probably going to be doing it better because they are experts in that. They've made that investment, and that kind of cross collaboration, that it's better for everybody. And fundamentally, students will do better in the class because it's going to be better organized and better designed.
Yeah.
So, oh yeah.
Go ahead, Mary.
Just Peter talked for a second kind of remind me of one of the other things that is a really big piece of advice is to consider different types of interactions in the class. Like you were saying, by having some of these auto-graded quizzes that check things, it freed them up to have a lot more interaction with students in emails or in any kind of sense that way. And to consider how are you interacting with what interactions are happening in your class, whether it's students with instructor, students with peers, not so much in this class, but in a lot of class, how are students interacting with their peers? How are they interacting with their content, in this case, the case studies, and how are they interacting with themselves in some sort of reflective type thing? So just as you're designing your class, not to get too all into like just students with content. That's the only thing I'm focusing on. It's got to be students with peers, students with self, students with instructors, students with content, all of that.
Yeah, I think you guys have really done a great job of kind of pointing out the things that maybe are different in this modality, but I think you've also done a good job for those that may be, skeptical or nervous about, moving into this online modality, pointing out that there are principles that are the same that they, either are already using or should be, things like backwards design in the way that they develop their courses and being mindful of the student. It's really just learner-centered design. And I think that can kind of demystify, moving into this online space. I think that there are plenty of things to consider moving in this direction, but there are also things that are relatively can be the same, and maybe can squash some misgivings about moving into an online space for sure. Okay, we are going to take just a quick break, and then we will be back with our continuing the conversation question.
Got a teaching idea worth sharing? Share it on AU Teaching Commons. We are Augusta University's first peer-reviewed hub of open teaching resources by faculty for faculty. Share your knowledge, help your peers, impact students. Visit us at guides.augusta.edu/AU Teaching Commons.
And we are back, and we are now going to ask our continuing the conversation question. So if you were talking to faculty and you were talking to them about starting another asynchronous course, what would be the one thing that you would do differently, and what would you do the same? And how would you talk to faculty about this?
This is a tough one because I think it went really well. It's hard to think of something I would do very, very differently. I think the same would be having that conversation at the beginning, getting everyone in the same mindset would always kind of do that. I think I love using wherever it's going to be wherever it's going to apply a story, whether it's a case study. There's a lot of courses that use case studies, but maybe use it on a smaller basis, just for 1 week or for one assignment. I think stretching it out and like including exercises as part of it can help a lot with the student engagement. So I would do that as often as possible. And I think there's a lot of scaffolding. I don't know how much we talked a little bit about the navigation, but where it was never like, here's something to students that's wildly out of like your ability to do. Each week had a really carefully planned, like, okay, for them to be doing this type of financial statement, they need to learn this, then this, then this. So I think if I were even showing maybe Peter's course as an example to faculty, I would point out that aspect of like, look how it was really clear for students where to go, how that built on top of each other, and how they could feel successful and feel like they created something at the end of it. So I guess that's what I would do the same. A couple of things different. I think when we got ourselves in pretty deep and like, oh wait, this is a bigger project than we thought it was going to be. It took a lot of time, a lot of effort. And so a little bit of it was like building the plane as we were flying at the end, and there was some like file management stuff, or like the last few modules were a little bit different structure than the first few in a way. And so now knowing that, I would have designed a couple little things different, but like having the idea of what is this going to be and trying to get this super, super big picture so that you don't end up being in a little bit of a bind about how things are organized at the end. But that worked out totally fine.
Dr. Demerjian?
Yeah, so for me, if I was going to do something different, I would have thought about scalability a little bit more throughout the process, because a few places, and especially as I'm refreshing the course for the next academic year, there's some spots where I've essentially made more work for myself than I really needed to. And it's not particularly scalable in terms of adding students adds quite a bit more effort. And ideally, especially for something like an online asynchronous, scalability matters a lot. This gives us an opportunity to potentially unlock a little bit of value that doesn't require a lot of faculty effort. But that is something that needs to be thought of in the design process. So that's something that I'm working to kind of retrofit that in place. So I'd certainly think about that a little bit more. In terms of what I do the same, reiterating a point that I made before, working with a course designer is critical. I think particularly for that introductory visioning phase about the course. This to me made all the difference in really setting the tone for exactly what I wanted this to be, where I wanted the students to be when they were done, and really the best way to kind of get there. And I feel like even if someone said to me at the beginning, Peter, you're going to design this course now, come up with a vision for how you're going to do it, I wouldn't have come up with anything like this on my own. So it was through that kind of collaborative process. So I'm a huge fan of that, and that's something that I think is indispensable and has really helped make the course as successful as it has been.
Well, this has been a really great conversation on collaboration and all the things that we've talked about as far as design goes. Are there any ways that our listeners can get in touch with you, or can follow you or communicate with you through maybe social media or things like that?
Yeah, so for me, I'm very active on LinkedIn. So you can send me a connection request or a message there. You also, if you go onto the Georgia State School of Accountancy website, you can find my email there, and I respond to all emails I receive, and I would love to hear from you, especially if you're thinking about doing something like this on your own and you'd like to hear more about my experience.
Great.
I'll ditto, Peter. LinkedIn is probably the best way to find me on there, or just Google Mary Peabody GSU, and you'll find my email address.
Great. Well, thank you both for being on Speaking of Higher Ed.
Thanks so much for having me. Thanks
for the invitation. It was fun.
Thanks for listening to Speaking of Higher Ed. You can find all episodes and more on our show page at augusta.edu/innovation. And continue the conversation with us at facebook.com/AUGCII. Speaking of Higher Ed is produced by the Center for Instructional Innovation at Augusta University.